On the right-hand side of the screen today, we have the Intel Arc B580 offering 12 gigabytes at a supposed MSRP of $250, but that has not really been available since launch day, and these are generally over $300. More on that in a minute. And then we have the other GPU trying to offer enough VRAM in a reasonable budget class. This is the Asus 9060 XT 16GB version, which is meant to have a $350 MSRP, however, is currently sold out at that price and is available at $390 in stock. However, it's only been out for a few days, so hopefully the MSRP goes back to being real, but based on how the 9070 series went, I will have to believe that when I see it. Now, there's a couple of things that you'll want to pause and talk about real quick on this chart. One is that I don't think my software reports Intel GPU power usage correctly, so that's lower than the GPU should actually be reporting, but the performance is where it should be, and Monster Hunter Wilds just happens to be not a very good game. For Intel Arc GPUs performance-wise. There we go. If I pop out, we'll see that this 80% win for the 9060 XT is not exactly going to be typical. This is more of a typical result, although we'll get back to the side-by-sides. So this is actually all of the tests that I ran. You can see that in this video, I'm focusing on the newest games, big games released in 2025 to see how these stack up against the heaviest big new games, to get an idea of how they might perform for the next few years if you're buying a new graphics card. You can see that Monster Hunter Wilds is particularly bad for Intel Arc. The numbers here are represented as the percentage advantage for one GPU or the other. Positive numbers are advantage for the 9060 XT 16GB. Negative numbers are advantage for the Intel Arc B580. So you can see that it gets some wins in Kingdom Come Deliverance 2's max settings and is fairly competitive at the non-max settings. But in the rest of the games, it's getting beat pretty badly. Now, what if we go ahead and sort this as best result for the 9060 XT to best result for the Arc B580 at the bottom? And I think we can generally see something that I think is more useful than the average, because averages just hide so much. I think a chart like this shows so much more. The geo mean here is that the 9060 XT 16GB is 46% faster, but I think it's actually, when both cards are operating kind of how they should be, it's less than 46% faster. I think a more typical result seems to be in this range, kind of somewhere between 20 and 50% faster, with, I would say, the raw power difference being somewhere here more in the upper 30s or lower 40% range. And then what happens on Intel Arc GPUs is just that some games just still don't play well with them. And that's what I'm seeing in Monster Hunter Wilds, and that's what I'm seeing in Spiderman 2, where we see that the differences between them get a lot bigger, and that's pulling up the average difference. Also, we get this ridiculous number right here. Well, what's going on there? Okay, so that's Spiderman 2 1440p max RT settings. And what's going on in that case is we're using more than 12 gigabytes of VRAM. So that's a case where having the 12 gigabytes as opposed to, the 16 versus the 12 is actually paying off. But are those settings where the AMD card was actually doing well enough for it to make sense? Well, that's where I think going back into these side-by-sides makes a lot of sense. But before we do that, let's make sure we understand what do these cards actually cost right now. So as I mentioned at the beginning, if I wanted to buy an Arc B580 right now in stock in the United States, the lowest price model listed is $280, above the listed MSRP, and that one's been out of stock and is usually out of stock. In stock, I would have to pay $310 right now. Now, I realize that pricing around the world is different, so this video may, the value propositions may come out differently for you in your region. Now, a 9060 XT 16GB model, please don't buy the 8GB model. We're seeing that, oh no, they're out of stock at their $350 MSRP, but they are in stock at $390. Well, that's a pretty big difference. So overall, we can look at the value difference between the two GPUs in a couple of ways. The at MSRP, the 9060 XT 16GB is meant to be 40% more expensive at $350 versus $250, and it's offering about that much more performance, but also a little bit more VRAM. And I would say that there's fewer games where it just weirdly underperforms. There are games where it weirdly underperforms, at least at certain settings, like we're seeing in Kingdom Come Deliverance 2. But in general, it's a little more consistent of experience, has a bit more VRAM. So I would say at MSRPs, it seems like the 9060 XT is offering better value despite being more expensive. Similar raw performance, more VRAM, that kind of thing. Whereas at current pricing, things look better for the 9060 XT and worse for the ARC B580. At the currently in stock lowest price in the United States, we're looking at $390 versus $310. That means that you would be spending 26% more money on the on the 9060 XT 16GB to get a graphics card that is usually delivering more than 26% more performance, and sometimes quite a bit more than that, and it has the extra VRAM, etc. So I would say that at both in-stock pricing and at MSRPs, the 9060 XT offers better value, but at MSRPs, it would be almost a wash other than the additional VRAM, and I still think AMD is a bit more consistent in driver support on games than the newer ARC cards, although they are getting significantly better. Whereas currently in stock pricing, it's a little bit more of a blowout win for the 9060 XT 16GB. But when we're looking at charts like this and we're seeing these giant wins for the 9060 XT, are these even at settings where the card can actually handle it? Is it even playable? And what about things like XeSS versus FSR? What does the image quality look like? Well, we are going to look at all of that in the side-by-sides. So buckle up, I've got side-by-side footage of every single one of these, I think like 63 benchmarks that I ran in the latest games at both maximum settings, but also medium settings, at native resolution, but also using upscaling, to show fully stressing the GPUs in the latest games, but also can they handle them at reduced settings if they can't handle them at max. Speaking of max settings, Monster Hunter Wilds 1080p max, the 9060 XT is actually very usable here at 56 FPS, whereas the B580 is only at 31, not doing particularly well. It's an 81% advantage for that 9060 XT. But what if we go ahead and kick on FSR and XeSS in this game? We set them to the same internal rendering resolution. This is what FSR or DLSS would call the quality mode, but XeSS in its newer versions renamed that scaling factor to balanced, so I'm not saying FSR and XeSS quality, I'm going to say 67% per axis internal rendering resolution. But if you're used to the names given for FSR and DLSS, just think of that as quality. Anyway, we can see here that now the 9060 XT is offering 66 FPS, which makes it 69% faster, which is nice compared to the 39 FPS on the B580. So the B580 is kind of usable here, but would definitely want to reduce settings further, well as the 9060 XT. I think you could absolutely play the game this way. Also look at image quality here. And I think you guys would agree that FSR 4, which is available in this game, is reconstructing a lot more of the detail on the monsters in the background, that kind of thing, compared with the XeSS algorithm. I think XeSS is very usable. It's its own machine learning algorithm and all that. But I do feel like I'm getting sharper textures and more detail on the AMD side of the screen. Again, look at the sword on the back of the character, that kind of thing. So games that have FSR 4 available, I do think it provides better image quality than XeSS. Now, what if we drop down to medium settings? Well, here we're seeing 1080p medium. The 9060 XT is good for 71 FPS, whereas the B580 is hitting 40. It's a 78% advantage for the 9060 XT. And if we use medium settings with upscaling, FSR and XeSS at 67% internal resolution, we're now seeing the B580 able to get 51 FPS. So what I'm seeing here is that Monster Hunter Wilds is just one of these games that just doesn't play super well on ARC GPUs. It can get to be playable, but it's hard to get it to average above 60 FPS, and even medium settings with upscaling and RT turned off is not quite getting there. 84 FPS on the 9060 XT here, which is 65% faster. At 1440p resolution and max settings, we're noticing the 9060 XT isn't doing great. It's arguably playable on a controller at 43 FPS, but not really the settings I'd want to use, whereas the B580 is at 24, so it's a 79% advantage for the 9060 XT. And using FSR and XeSS upscaling here, and this time at a 58% internal rendering resolution per axis. That's what DLSS and FSR call the balanced mode. XeSS would call it, oh geez, is it performance mode, I think? Anyway, annoying how they've named those, but these are set to the same internal rendering resolution. Now, we see the 9060 XT is now extremely playable at 56 FPS, so if you're on a variable refresh rate display on a controller, I think that's a very reasonable way to play this game, whereas the B580 is hitting 33 FPS, and again, if you look at like the textures on the characters and things like that right now, I think most people would agree that FSR 4 is reconstructing more fine detail. It looks a bit sharper, whereas the XeSS image is a bit more blurred. 1440p medium settings, we're seeing 54 FPS versus 31, 74% advantage for the 9060 XT, and despite being at medium settings, the B580 is not particularly playable here. But we could use upscaling along with the medium settings, but that really only gets the B580 up to about 46 FPS, whereas the 9060 XT is hitting 70, which is a 52% advantage. Now, let's check out some other games though. How about Oblivion Remastered? This game is showing less dominant victory for the 9060 XT, but still a pretty dominant victory. But again, it's a more expensive graphics card. So the 9060 XT here is at 45 FPS versus 32 on the B580, at 41% advantage for the 9060 XT, but not the most amazingly playable settings on either of them. But this is max settings, ultra with the hardware ray-traced lumen set to its ultra mode as well. If we go down to upscaling on the maximum settings, now the 9060 XT, I would argue, is very playable here at 58 FPS average, putting it 35% ahead of the B580, which is only at 43 FPS. Using 1080p medium settings and turning off hardware-based lumen and switching over to software lumen, it's now 91 FPS on the 9060 XT versus 60 on the B580, 52% lead for AMD here. But again, the B580 is now actually quite playable at a 60 FPS average. 1080p medium with upscaling, again at the 67% per axis resolution scaling there. The 9060 XT is now hitting 114 FPS versus 77 on the B580, which is a 48% lead for the AMD GPU. And 1440p max settings, we're seeing 32 versus 23, so neither one's doing great, but it is a 39% advantage for the 9060 XT. If we kick on upscaling, the 9060 XT reaches 47 FPS, which is arguably playable on a controller, but I'd probably still turn things down further. And the B580 is at 36 FPS, 31% lead for the 9060 XT here. 1440p medium settings, we're seeing 59 FPS versus 42 for the 9060 XT, 40% advantage. And 1440p medium with upscaling, we're now seeing 91 FPS on the 9060 XT, putting it 42% ahead of the B580 at 64 FPS. In Marvel's Spiderman 2 1080p max settings here, I want to point out something kind of interesting for pause for a second. Another thing besides the power usage that Intel seems to report differently to my software, where again, the power rating is lower than it should be, meaning it's actually drawing more power than what it's reporting here, is what I'm trying to say. The VRAM usage is reported differently as well. On AMD and NVIDIA cards, it will not report more more VRAM allocation or usage than the card actually has. If stuff spills over into system memory, you just have to watch the RAM number and see if it kind of ticks up when things seem to be spilling over. Whereas it seems like the Intel card is reporting this differently. This GPU only has 12 gigabytes of VRAM, but it's currently reporting 14 gigabytes of allocation. In other words, I think what we're getting here is confirmation that it's trying to actually allocate 14 gigabytes, and so it is having to spill over into system memory, and we do see system memory higher here than we see here. So I think that's interesting, and I think that could explain what is happening with the performance numbers here, where the 9060 XT is 138% faster, 2.38 times the performance. So 57 FPS versus 24. The 9060 XT is very, very usable at maximum settings in this game at 1080p, whereas the B580 does not have enough VRAM. If we use upscaling, it's now 78 FPS on the 9060 XT versus 32 on the B580, once again seeming like VRAM issues on the B580. 1080p medium settings, 119 versus 55, and then when we go to medium with upscaling, it's 153 FPS versus 76. At 1440p max settings, we're seeing 39 FPS versus 8, and then it crashes. So again, just a VRAM issue going on here. Actually, I think a bit on both cards, but the AMD card has more and is better able to handle it. Still not performing super well, though. Yes, there's my BSOD. And then if we use upscaling, the 9060 XT is able to average 54 FPS with otherwise maximum settings, and the B580's at 22, but does complete it without a crash this time. 1440p medium settings are 82 versus 39. And then medium settings with upscaling, the B580 is able to hit 62 FPS, but the 9060 XT is like twice as fast at 119. In Assassin's Creed Shadows, neither GPU does great at max settings, 39 versus 28, but 39% advantage for the 9060 XT. And if we kick on upscaling, we're seeing 47 versus 33, 42% advantage for the 9060 XT. If we are at 1080p medium settings with RT set to hideout only, which I think disables it for this benchmark run because I don't think this is in the hideout, we're seeing 83 FPS versus 53, 57% lead for the 9060 XT, but it is now playable on the B580. And using medium settings with upscaling at 1080p, we're at 92 and 61 respectively. So the B580 is now averaging over 60 FPS, but the 9060 XT is offering a higher refresh rate experience. 1440p max settings, we're seeing 31 versus 23, 35% lead for the 9060 XT. And we're seeing at max settings 1440p, but with upscaling, we're at 42 versus 30, so 40% lead on the 9060 XT. At medium settings 1440p at 67 versus 54, it's now only a 24% advantage for the 9060 XT. And at medium settings 1440p with upscaling, we're at 81 FPS versus 64, 27% advantage for the 9060 XT. And Doom the Dark Ages, 1080p max settings, which are currently Ultra Nightmare. There is no path tracing mode yet. They've announced one incoming, so if you're watching this in the future, path tracing mode not out yet. Otherwise, maximum settings here. 74 FPS versus 52, 42% advantage for the 9060 XT. And if we kick on upscaling, it's 100 versus 70. But this is a game where XeSS looks pretty good, and FSR 3 doesn't look as good. You could use XeSS on the AMD GPU, but it wouldn't be the XMX version. More on that in a minute. 1080p medium settings, 86 versus 59, 46% advantage for the 9060 XT. And medium settings with upscaling is 122 versus 83, 47% performance lead for the 9060 XT, but I do think XeSS looks a little better here. 1440p max settings, 1440p max settings, here we go. 51 FPS versus 36, 42% lead for the 9060 XT, and with upscaling, we're at 82 versus 58, 41% lead for the 9060 XT. 1440p medium is 59 versus 41, 44% advantage for the 9060 XT. And 1440p medium with upscaling is 97 versus 67, 45% advantage for the 9060 XT. Kingdom Come Deliverance 2, though, man, I feel like I have to sneeze. Excuse me. Tried not to sneeze as loudly into the microphone as I could have. Hopefully we're okay. Anyway, here we actually get a win for the B580, but it's in a situation where I don't think you would use these settings on either GPU. I've seen that the experimental settings in Kingdom Come Deliverance 2, which is its maximum settings in this game, do not run well on most GPUs, but seem to run especially bad on the AMD GPUs I've been testing lately. So the B580 takes an 18% lead at 33 FPS versus 28, but like I said, not an amazing experience on either of them. If we stay at the max settings but enable upscaling, here we see a game that does not have XeSS support. But this game does have FSR 4 support, which means that upscaling on the Arc GPU has to use FSR 3.1, whereas AMD can use FSR 4 if you're on the 90 series cards. So the B580 is 28% faster here, but if you look at the side-by-side images, I think the, look at how the the leaves in the trees and things like that are reconstructing. It looks a lot more solid on the left-hand side of the screen. Anyway, neither one particularly playable at those settings. If we drop down to medium settings, now both GPUs are doing great, 118 versus 110. But notice that this is just not a great game for the 90 series cards. They don't perform well versus NVIDIA here, and this is a game where even at the medium settings now, the B580 isn't winning, but the 9060 XT is only 7% faster, despite being a much more expensive graphics card, and generally more powerful. 1080p medium with upscaling, we're seeing a 7% lead for the 9060 XT at 141 versus 132, but I probably would stay away from upscaling on the B580 here due to the having to use FSR 3 and being able to get good performance without upscaling. 1440p max settings is another win for the B580, but it's only at 29 FPS versus 24, 21% lead for the B580. And using upscaling, we're seeing 34 versus 27, so not a great experience on either GPU. And the AMD one does look better. Again, look at the leaves and things like that, a lot more shimmery and pixelated looking on the right-hand side of the screen, especially if you look at the top where it had the like sky in the background. Anyway, 34 versus 27 FPS, not great on either. 26% lead for the B580, but worse image quality. 1440p medium, they're basically tied at 81 and 80 FPS. And medium with upscaling, we're basically tied at 109 versus 107. But again, I do think the upscaling looks better on the left-hand side of the screen for the AMD GPU. Now we're looking at Clair Obscur Expedition 33, 1080p max settings, 44% advantage for the 9060 XT at 52 versus 36. And if we use upscaling here, this one's interesting. They can both use XeSS, but on Intel hardware, you actually get a better version of XeSS that is accelerated using its XMX matrix cores. Whereas on non-Intel branded GPUs, when you're using XeSS, you're using a DP4A fallback, a dot product for, anyway, the point is, it's not quite as good. So you could see the image quality on both sides isn't wildly different, but it is a little sharper. I don't know if this will get through YouTube compression, but I can see it myself in person. It is a little sharper on the right-hand side of the screen. Anyway, thought I'd point that out. 72 versus 53 FPS, 36% performance lead for the 9060 XT, which now grows to a 62% performance lead at medium settings, and this is now native on both. And then if we use medium settings with upscaling, again, I think it looks slightly better on the right-hand side of the screen due to using the XMX pathway. But performance-wise, it's 104 versus 71, so a 46% advantage for the 9060 XT. Now we're looking at 1440p max settings, 35 versus 26, 35% advantage for the 9060 XT. And if we go to max settings with upscaling, it's 60 versus 45, so 33% faster on the 9060 XT. But again, I think the XMX upscaling version looks a little better on the right. Medium settings, 1440p is 58 versus 39, 49% advantage for the 9060 XT. And using upscaling, we get to 88 and 60, 47% lead for the 9060 XT. Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, 1080p max settings is 75 versus 58, 29% advantage for the 9060 XT. And unfortunately, if you're going to upscale, this doesn't have FSR or XeSS, so they both look awful using TAA. It's TAAU at 88 versus 68 FPS, 29% lead for the 9060 XT. 1080p medium, we're seeing 87 versus 63, so they're both very playable, 38% lead for the 9060 XT. And 1440p max settings are 59 versus 45, 31% lead for the 9060 XT. And max settings with upscaling is 76 versus 58 at 1440p, 31% lead for the 9060 XT, but again, I don't like the look of the upscaler here. 1440p medium is 69 nice versus 50, 38% lead for the 9060 XT, and 1440p medium with upscaling is 91 versus 67, but again, I don't think the upscaling looks very good here. And that is all the tests that I ran. So let's summarize this. So what's going on here? Well, on the geomean of the results, we're getting the 46% advantage for the 9060 XT. I think the true raw performance lead is more typically in that 30 to 40% range, but it is over 40% in some games. And in some games, it's a huge win in games that just aren't performing well on the Intel Arc hardware, which seems to be the case for Spiderman 2. And then that gets even worse on the settings where it spills over its VRAM capacity. Monster Hunter Wilds was another one that didn't seem to go well. Kingdom Come Deliverance 2 was a standout more in the favor of the B580. But in general, I would say, again, at current pricing, the 9060 XT offers better value, although still is more expensive. So if you're looking for a card with more than 8 gigabytes of VRAM and you were deciding between the ARC B580 or the 9060 XT, I would say that if the 9060 XT is in your budget, try to get it, although hopefully it'll come back in stock at its $350 MSRP, which if it did that and was still up against $310 B580s, then you're only spending 13% more money for significantly more performance, more VRAM, and just more consistent experience. And again, I did think that FSR 4 looked sharper than XeSS in the games that supported both, although XeSS is very usable, especially with its XMX version. All right, hopefully you guys found the video useful and or interesting. Stay tuned to the channel for more big head-to-head benchmarks and all of that. I'll be doing a ton of them all the time. And also GPU news and everything. I hope you guys found the video useful and or interesting, and I hope you have an excellent day.